The courtroom was cloaked in a tense, almost electric silence as Judge Greg Mathis leaned forward, his commanding presence slicing through the heat of the studio lights. The rich burgundy and gold decor of his iconic set glistened under the glare. More than just set design, it was the backdrop of 2 decades of televised authority. For years, Mathis had presided over this space with the confidence of a man who had seen everything and could not be shaken. But today was different. Opposite him, seated in the witness chair, with spine-straight posture and sharp, calculated calm, was Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. She looked every bit the composed public servant. Her crisp burgundy blazer mirrored the judge's set, perhaps coincidental, perhaps not. Her hair was pulled back in a tight, professional style, her demeanor that of someone ready to walk into fire and come out the other side untouched. The audience, nearly 200 strong, sat forward in their seats, anticipation gripping the room. Like static before a storm, these were not passive viewers. They were diehard fans of Judge Mathis's courtroom legacy. They had flown in from across the country to see the man who'd made a career out of exposing excuses and cutting through political doublespeak. Most expected a spirited, yet respectful dialogue. What they got instead was the kind of television moment that lives on in viral clips, headlines, and the national memory. Judge Mathis opened the segment with his signature baritone, sharp as a gavel. "Congresswoman Crockett," he began, his words echoing like a challenge across the set. "You claim to be a champion of justice, yet your voting record tells another story. Are you here to defend your actions, or just to hide behind another polished political speech?" Gasps rippled through the audience. A few jaws dropped. This wasn't a town hall. This wasn't This was an ambush broadcast in HD. But Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't shift in her chair. She didn't glance at her notes. Instead, she offered the most unsettling response possible in such a moment. A smile, not a smirk, not nervous laughter, but the calm, precise smile of someone who had walked into the lion's den on purpose. "Judge Mathis," she said evenly, her voice as steady as the Texas earth. "Before you scrutinize my record, perhaps we should take a closer look at yours, because I didn't come empty-handed today. I brought some receipts, and they just might surprise everyone in this room." Suddenly, the courtroom wasn't just hot, it was scalding. The camera zoomed in on Mathis's face. His confident grin flickered, the surety in his posture giving way to something much more human, concern. Behind the scenes, producers scrambled, whispering into headsets, realizing they were no longer running a show, they were witnessing a cultural flashpoint unfolding live. Before we unpack how Jasmine Crockett flipped the courtroom and dismantled Judge Mathis on his own turf, don't forget to drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Tap subscribe, ring the bell, because trust us, the next 5 minutes are about to be history in the making. This moment had been building long before the taping. It wasn't just a clash of personalities. It was the inevitable collision of 2 opposing forces shaped by decades of contrasting experience. On one side stood Judge Greg Mathis, the embodiment of old-school justice, forged in the fires of Detroit's toughest neighborhoods, a man who rose from district court benches to national fame. His TV show wasn't just entertainment, it was a platform, a pulpit. For over 20 years, he'd preached accountability, personal responsibility, and tough love to millions of loyal viewers. He was the kind of man who could silence a courtroom with a single glance and had built his brand by telling uncomfortable truths without apology. His fans admired him for that, saw him as the wise uncle or strict father figure the country needed. But recently, Mathis's commentary had shifted, growing more political, more pointed. In the past year, he'd begun taking aim at a specific group of people, young progressive lawmakers. He labeled Twitter politicians. He accused them of chasing clout instead of crafting legislation, using hashtags as policy tools, and confusing virality for vision. Though he never said her name outright, everyone knew that one of his primary targets was Jasmine Crockett. Crockett, however, chose silence. While her staff urged her to issue a response or defend her record on social media, she stayed quiet, not out of fear but out of strategy. She knew her moment would come, and when it did, it wouldn't be a tweet, it would be a reckoning, because Jasmine Crockett wasn't just another politician. She was a fighter born in the courtrooms of Texas, not the cocktail lounges of Capitol Hill. Before she ever held elected office, she was a civil rights attorney and public defender, a woman who had stood beside people society had already given up on and fought tooth and nail for their rights. She had looked injustice in the eye more times than most of her critics ever would, and she didn't just understand Loesch, understood power. Her rise to Congress wasn't funded by political dynasties or billionaires. It was grassroots, earned. Every campaign stop, every debate, every late-night policy session built on hustle, vision, and authenticity. She'd brought the courtroom to Congress, and now, full circle, she was back in a courtroom again, this time with the cameras rolling. But this time, she wasn't the one on trial. Jasmine Crockett's journey to Congress was not paved with privilege, legacy, or connections. It was carved out of grit, sacrifice, and an unrelenting belief in justice. Born and raised in a working-class neighborhood of St. Louis, She grew up watching her single mother juggle multiple jobs just to keep food on the table and the lights on. Those long nights when the rent was uncertain and the fridge was almost bare didn't break her, they forged her. It wasn't political science, books that taught her how systems fail people. It was watching eviction notices show up before paychecks. It was watching neighbors get pulled over simply for driving while black. Her understanding of the justice system wasn't theoretically, it was painfully personal. So, when she became a lawyer, she didn't head to a corporate firm or seek fame. In high-profile law, she went to the margins, the courtrooms filled with the forgotten. She built her reputation defending those whom the system preferred to ignore, people who couldn't afford lawyers, who were fighting uphill battles against police misconduct, against corrupt city officials, against rigged systems, while other attorneys cherry-picked easy wins. Crockett waded into cases deemed impossible, and she won again and again. Her name became synonymous with courage in the Texas legal world. She wasn't just a good lawyer. She was the kind of advocate who made the powerful uncomfortable. It wasn't long before Democratic Party leaders took notice. They saw in her what voters were desperate for: authenticity, fight, and results. When she ran for Congress, she didn't rely on polished consultants or billionaire donors. She knocked doors. She showed up at town halls. She built trust, face to face, one voter at a time. And when she finally landed in Washington, she didn't tiptoe around power. She kicked the doors open. While many freshman representatives eased into Congress with cautious optimism, Crockett came in like a thunderclap. She didn't wait to be invited into the conversation. She took the microphone, whether she was grilling corporate executives during committee hearings, calling out political hypocrisy on both sides of the aisle, or giving fiery floor speeches about police accountability. She had a knack for slicing through spin and speaking with rare clarity. Viral moments weren't her goal, but they became her side effect. In a political landscape addicted to empty performance, she made truth feel revolutionary, but that raw, unfiltered honesty made her a target. To the establishment, she was disruptive. To her critics, she was too loud, too bold, or too young. And for Judge Greg Mathis, a man who had spent decades cultivating a persona built on control, order, and tough love, she represented a threat not just to political norms, but to his ideology. Judge Mathis saw this televised interview as an opportunity to humble her, to remind the country that experience still outweighed energy. His plan was simple: expose her as all talk, no results. His team had compiled a dossier packed with selective statistics, out-of-context quotes, and cherry-picked critiques. This was more than an interview, it was an ambush. On his set, with his audience, in his courtroom, but Crockett had walked into plenty of rooms where the odds were stacked against her. She recognized the setup the moment she stepped onto the set. What Mathis didn't know was that Jasmine had spent the previous week preparing just as rigorously as he had, maybe more. She'd reviewed her voting record down to the last line item, pulled internal memos, and had a folder ready to expose inconsistencies in Mathis's own public comments. Because she knew the real key to winning wasn't having better answers. It was knowing when to flip the script. That as the cameras rolled and studio lights blazed, Mathis launched the first volley with the practiced flair of someone used to controlling the room. "Congresswoman, let's talk about real results," he said, adjusting his robe as he leaned back in his chair, voice deep and probing. "You've been in Congress for nearly 2 years. You've introduced legislation, made speeches, gone viral on Twitter. But what have you actually accomplished? What laws have you passed that have changed anyone's life?" The audience murmured, clearly impressed with the pointed question. This was classic Mathis, direct, no nonsense, and laced with just enough condescension to draw blood. But Crockett didn't blink. Her posture didn't shift. She didn't even glance at her notes. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, met his gaze with that same unflinching courtroom calm, and replied, "Judge Mathis, I appreciate the question, and I'd be happy to walk you through my legislative accomplishments. But first, may I ask you something?" Mathis raised a brow, surprised. "Go ahead," he said cautiously. "When was the last time you sat in a real courtroom, handling real cases, dealing with real people, instead of staging dramatized interrogations for television?" The room went silent. The temperature dropped. The audience froze, unsure whether to gasp or applaud. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. No one dared challenge Judge Mathis on his own show. Mathis's jaw tightened slightly, though his voice remained calm. "Young lady, I've been fighting for justice longer than you've been out of law school. My courtroom may be televised now, but the principles are the same. Don't dodge my question with another question." Crockett didn't hesitate. "I'm not dodging, Judge. I'm giving you context. Because you're questioning my results without acknowledging the obstacles young lawmakers face, especially black women trying to navigate a system designed to exclude them. And you're doing it in front of an audience that thinks this is about political theater, but this isn't theater to me. This is my life's work." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The fire was in her precision. "You ask what laws I've passed. Let's start with the bipartisan bail reform package I co-sponsored that's reducing pretrial incarceration in 3 states. Or the amendment I led to restore funding for reentry programs for the formerly incarcerated, or the federal grant program I championed to support small black-owned businesses shut out of pandemic relief. And if you want receipts, she said, reaching for a folder, I brought plenty. Mathis stared, caught off guard, not by anger, but by calm, calculated competence. The courtroom was still. The audience leaned in. This wasn't just a clash of generations. It was a battle between legacy and evolution, between old-school authority and new-school power. And Jasmine Crockett had just changed the rules of the game. Because unlike the neatly packaged theatrics of television courtrooms, real legislative work is messy. It demands collaboration, coalition building, and compromise. It takes years, sometimes decades, not for lack of will, but because laws aren't changed by speeches, they're changed by strategy, pressure, and relentless persistence. Something, Crockett added, her voice cool and steady, you might understand if you'd ever spent time in a legislature, instead of simply lobbing criticism at those of us actually doing the work. The courtroom tensed like a coiled spring. Even the cameras seemed to lean closer. Behind the scenes, Mathis's production crew exchanged worried glances. This wasn't following the familiar pattern. The judge was used to being the one steering the conversation. Now, for the first time, it felt like he was being led. Didn't like it? Judge Mathis leaned forward, his voice sharp as a scalpel. Let's talk specifics then. Your much-hyped criminal justice reform bill, the one you've been parading across social media for months, it's been stuck in committee for 8 months with zero movement. Meanwhile, real people are sitting in jail waiting for the change you promised. Isn't that just more political theater? He delivered the line like a verdict. His audience nodded, murmuring approval. To them, this was Mathis in peak form, cutting through spin with facts. He thought he had found her weak spot. He thought he had her cornered. He was wrong. Crockett didn't blink. She didn't flinch. Her expression barely shifted except for the faintest curl of a knowing smile. Then she leaned slightly forward, locking eyes with the judge. Judge Mathis, she said, her voice silk-wrapped steel, since you want to talk about that bill in particular, let me share something your research team must have missed. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a folder, thick, worn at the edges, and clearly well used. The kind of folder you bring when you don't just come to defend yourself. You come to prosecute. 3 weeks ago, she began, each word razor sharp. Your production company Justice Works Entertainment received a $2.3 million contract from Faircore Holdings. Mathis's brows furrowed. That's the same private prison conglomerate that's been actively lobbying against my bill. The same company that profits every time a person of color is sentenced to extended incarceration. The same company that's funding think tanks to block reforms like mine across multiple states. The courtroom erupted, gasps, audible gasps. Murmurs spread like wildfire. Camera operators instinctively zoomed in on the judge's face, and what they captured would soon be broadcast across millions of screens. A flicker of panic behind the stoic mask. Mathis's confident smirk evaporated. His lips parted slightly, his jaw tightening. He looked caught because he was. Crockett wasn't finished. She stood now, her posture commanding. So, yes, my bill is in committee, and yes, it's facing delays. But maybe the real question isn't why it's stuck. Maybe the real question is, who's paying to keep it there, and why are they writing checks to you? Mathis jolted out of his chair, visibly rattled. His voice rose, tinged with indignation. How dare you come into my courtroom and make wild accusations based on conspiracy theories and paperwork you barely understand? But Crockett remained unfazed. She held the folder up. Oh, I understand it just fine. This isn't Twitter, Judge. This is documented. And signed, your name, your production company, their check. In the control room, chaos erupted. Producers whispered frantically into headsets. Some argued to cut to commercial. Others insisted they stay. Live ratings were skyrocketing by the second. On social media, hashtags were already trending. Hashtag MATTHYSSE meltdown. Hashtag Crockett claps back. And hashtag receipts in session. Back in the studio, the tension could be sliced with a knife. Phones emerged from pockets. Viewers in the live audience began recording. They knew they were witnessing the kind of moment that gets replayed in slow motion on the evening news. Crockett opened the folder with surgical precision. The contract, she said, letting the papers fall open. Public record. Dated precisely 3 days before your media tour bashing reformers like me. Same tour that featured 3 segments promoting toughen crime legislation happens to be lobbying for. Curious timing, wouldn't you say? Mathis's face turned crimson. His voice, usually a weapon of authority, now wavered. My business dealings have nothing to do with my values. I've been a champion for justice longer than you've been alive. Crockett's eyes narrowed. Her voice dropped half an octave, low and deliberate. Have you, or have you just been performing it? She reached into her briefcase once more, this time, slowly, deliberately. The audience leaned in. Some held their breath. The hum of the lights, the buzz of a fly, even the distant hum of a phone vibrating on silent hall seemed amplified by the silence. I also brought something else, she said. Something every person in this room and everyone watching at home deserves to see. She pulled out a slim black USB drive and held it up between her fingers. "What's on here," she said, "is going to make people question everything. They thought they knew about justice on television, and about you, Judge Mathis." The judge stiffened. For the first time in his 20-plus years on national television, he no longer looked like the one in control. His hands gripped the edges of his bench. His shoulders tightened. He glanced toward his producers. Perhaps, looking for a lifeline. There was none. Jasmine Crockett rose fully to her feet now, not as a guest, not as a defendant, but as a prosecutor armed with evidence, conviction, and timing. "This drive," she said, "contains internal memos, leaked by a whistleblower inside Faircorp Holdings. Emails that show their strategy to target reform-minded legislators, including myself, by co-opting media figures with influence." She took a single step forward, including a television judge with a household name. A collective gasp echoed through the room. One woman covered her mouth. A man near the front audibly whispered, "Oh my God." Mathis looked like he'd aged 10 years in 10 seconds. The audience was frozen. America was watching, and Jasmine Crockett had just redefined what it meant to deliver justice on live TV. They were about to witness something no one in that studio or across the millions of screens watching at home had ever seen before. The atmosphere in the courtroom didn't just shift, it transformed. The lighting seemed to sharpen, almost as if the very studio itself sensed that power was changing hands. Cameras operated by seasoned professionals who'd filmed thousands of hours of courtroom television, instinctively adjusted to capture every movement, every expression, every beat. Because this wasn't a debate, this wasn't banter, this was a reckoning. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett moved with quiet precision, not a single wasted motion. She exuded the calm, deliberate energy of someone who knew she was holding the winning hand and had waited patiently for just the right moment to lay it down. Then she spoke, and her voice carried across the courtroom like a gavel crack in total silence. "Judge Mathis," she began, each syllable clipped with surgical control, "you asked about my legislative record. Fair enough. But before I answer that, I think this audience and the millions watching deserve to know why you're really asking these questions." The word really landed like a thunderclap, its sharpness slicing through the air. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. The audience, already riveted, leaned forward as if drawn by some invisible gravity. They knew instinctively that something major was about to happen. This wasn't pushback. This wasn't damage control. This was a calculated dismantling. What legal scholars would later call one of the most devastating public cross-examinations in televised history. From her folder, Crockett pulled a document bold, clear, and damning. She held it up for the cameras. "This," she declared, her voice steady, "is a legally binding contract. A 3-year agreement between Mathis Entertainment, your company, and Correct Solutions, one of the largest private prison corporations in the United States." Murmurs erupted across the courtroom. Several audience members gasped. Dozens lifted their phones to record. The energy shifted from anticipation to open astonishment. $2.3 million, she continued, eyes locked on the judge. "For media consulting and content development. That's what it says." Mathis stiffened. His voice, usually deep and commanding, now cracked under pressure. "That's a business contract," he snapped. "It has nothing to do with my views or this show." Crockett offered a small, measured smile, not smug, not mocking, just the smile of a woman who'd been underestimated. Doggone was now proving her doubters wrong in real time. "Really?" she said softly. Then her voice sharpened as she reached into the folder again. "Because this is an internal email from Corcorec's Vice President of Government Relations, sent directly to your lead producer." She unfolded it with deliberate slowness, her delivery like that of a seasoned trial lawyer addressing a jury. Quote, "Thank you for agreeing to help shift the narrative on criminal justice reform. The recent push by progressive legislators like Crockett is threatening our business model. Having Judge Mathis challenge their effectiveness on air would be incredibly valuable to our legislative strategy." End quote. The courtroom erupted. It wasn't just shock, it was outrage. Viewers gasped aloud. Some shouted in disbelief. Others exchanged furious whispers. Even Mathis's camera crew stopped moving for a moment, stunned by what had just been revealed. Mathis's face twisted into disbelief. His polished composure had cracked wide open. His hands trembled slightly as they gripped the edge of the bench. But Crockett wasn't done. "You want to question my effectiveness?" she asked, her voice rising with passion but never losing control. "Then let's talk about what I've actually done while you were signing media deals with corporations that profit from human suffering." She pulled another document, this one thicker, heavier, filled with pages of legislative language. "This is the Second Chance Act amendment. I co-sponsored it with members from both parties. It expands education and job training programs in federal prisons. It's designed to cut recidivism by 40% over 5 years." She didn't wait for a reaction. "This," she said, lifting another document, "is the Police Accountability and Transparency Act. It ties federal funding for law enforcement to real accountability measures, body cams, civilian oversight, public reporting." Another. This is the Bail Reform Act. It eliminates cash bail for nonviolent offenses nationwide, so that poverty is no longer a prison sentence. Judge Mathis tried to interject, his voice rising, trying to reclaim control. Anyone can introduce bills, Congresswoman. That doesn't mean you've achieved anything. Crockett didn't miss a beat. You're absolutely right, she said, turning toward him, her tone sharper now. Anyone can write a bill, but not everyone can get them through committee. Not everyone can survive the lobbying pressure from companies like CoreCorrect Solutions. She paused just long enough for the weight of her next words to land. The Second Chance Act passed the House with bipartisan support 3 weeks ago. The Police Accountability Act, it's been fast-tracked in the Senate, and the Bail Reform Act is headed for markup next month. The audience erupted in applause. Not polite clapping standing applause, but Crockett raised a hand, and they fell silent again, like a choir obeying its conductor. But do you know what really matters, Judge? She asked, her voice now rich with righteous fury. While you've spent 20 years lecturing defendants and playing judge in a television studio, I've been in real courtrooms, defending real people, filing real lawsuits, winning real justice. She took a step closer to the bench, now face to face with the man who once commanded this room. I've overturned wrongful convictions. I've sued corrupt police departments. I've gone toe-to-toe with the same private prison companies who write you checks. Her voice swelled with conviction. You want to talk about my Twitter account? That Twitter account helped shine a national spotlight on the inhumane conditions in Harris County Jail. It forced a federal investigation. It led to $50 million in improvements. Another beat, and those viral videos of mine, the ones you mocked. Her tone turned razor sharp. They helped indict 3 corporate executives for fraud last year. That's more justice than most politicians get done in a decade. Judge Mathis leaned back in his chair, visibly shaken. For 2 decades, he'd been the one asking the tough questions, exposing flaws, holding others accountable. But now, on live national television, the tables had turned and it was clear he wasn't ready for it. You came at me today, Crockett said, her voice now pulsing with power, thinking you could embarrass a young black woman who didn't know her place. She paused, looked around the courtroom, then looked straight into the camera. But I do know my place. It's right here, leading, fighting, serving, and exposing anyone who profits from injustice while pretending to care about it. In that moment, Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a congresswoman, she was a movement. But what you didn't realize, Jasmine Crockett said, turning back to Judge Mathis, her tone now carrying the cold precision of a scalpel, is that I've been preparing for bullies like you my entire life. The words landed like a thunderclap. The room fell into a stillness so complete it was almost sacred. In law school, in courtrooms, and now in Congress, there's always someone older, louder, richer who thinks they can intimidate me. Someone who underestimates me because I'm young, because I'm a woman, because I don't play by their rules. She turned slowly toward the audience, her gaze sweeping across a sea of faces, now hanging on her every word. Judge Mathis built his entire brand on holding people accountable. But here's a question. Who holds him accountable? Who interrogates him when the cameras aren't rolling? Who questions how someone who claims to fight for justice is cashing checks from the very corporations that profit off injustice? There was a moment of stunned silence, and then it happened. People began to rise slowly at first, then all at once. Applause erupted, raw and thunderous, echoing off the studio walls. The energy shifted entirely. This wasn't Mathis's courtroom anymore. This was Crockett's stage. Judge Mathis sat frozen behind his bench, glancing nervously at the crowd, the camera lights, the crew, his show, his audience, his authority, all slipping away in real time. Crockett didn't wait for the room to settle. She walked calmly back, toward her chair but did not sit. Instead, she faced the cameras, now speaking directly to the millions watching at home. This, she said, her voice steady but laced with fire. This is exactly what's wrong with our system. People get comfortable, they get famous, they get rich, and somewhere along the way, they forget why they started. They stop fighting for the people and start fighting to protect their image, their money, their brand. She paused, letting her words settle like dust on a battlefield. They take money from the very institutions they should be standing up to, and then have the nerve to question those of us who are actually doing the work. The air in the courtroom grew electric. Then she delivered the line that would be replayed in news clips and memes for weeks. Judge Mathis, you asked me what I've accomplished. I'll tell you. I've done something you haven't managed in 20 years of television. I've actually changed laws. I've put corrupt officials in prison, not just lectured the people already in them. And I've done it all without taking a single dime from the corporations that keep our justice system broken. The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time in his broadcast career, Judge Mathis, famous for always having the last word, was completely, utterly speechless. Finally, Crockett sat. She crossed her legs, folded her hands, and looked straight at him. Now, Judge, she said with a cool smile, did you have any other questions about my record? The aftermath? A cultural earthquake. The moment the cameras stopped rolling, chaos erupted, not just in the courtroom, but across the country. Producers scrambled. Phones rang off the hook. Newsrooms lit up with breaking alerts. Within minutes, clips from the confrontation began tearing across the internet like wildfire. The hashtag Crockett exposes Mathisse trended globally within an hour. The moment Crockett revealed the private prison contract, shared over 100,000 times in the first 60 minutes. Within 24 hours, YouTube uploads of the segment hit 2.7 million views. TikTok edits, stitched with commentary and reaction videos, flooded every major feed. Fans of the show, some of whom had been watching Mathis for decades, were stunned. One viral comment read, "I've watched this judge my entire life. I've never seen someone flip the courtroom like this. She didn't just survive, she dominated." Another wrote, "Jasmine Crockett didn't come to play games. This is what happens when a real attorney meets a TV judge." Even political opponents had to admit what they'd seen was undeniable. Media reaction, unprecedented. Sannon ran continuous coverage, leading with Congresswoman School's TV judge on his own set. They followed with a full special report titled, "Private Prisons, Public Scandals, the Media Contracts Behind the Bench." MSNBC's Rachel Maddow opened her primetime segment by calling Crockett's performance a historic moment in political television and a masterclass in how to dismantle a rigged narrative with poise, facts, and ferocity. The New York Times published a Sunday front-page story titled, "The Courtroom Confrontation That Changed Television Justice Forever." The piece examined the ethical minefield surrounding Mathis's connections to the private prison industry and the quiet power of prepared legislators. The Washington Post's fact-checking team spent 3 days vetting every document presented. The conclusion, Congresswoman Crockett's claims were accurate, verifiable, and presented with extraordinary even international media took notice. The BBC ran a feature titled, "A Televised Takedown, America Watches Justice Meet Its Match." They described it as a uniquely American collision of spectacle and substance, where entertainment met its reckoning. Le Monde, Der Spiegel, and Al Jazeera all ran op-eds about the growing divide between image-based justice and policy-based leadership in the U.S. The most unexpected praise, and then came the shocker. Fox News, typically hostile toward progressive Democrats, had a surprising reaction. On his broadcast, Tucker Carlson said, "Look, I disagree with nearly everything Jasmine Crockett stands for, but that wasn't politics, that was warfare. She came in with facts. She stayed cool. She flipped the entire script. That kind of preparation should scare every political opponent she has." Even Sean Hannity offered unexpected respect. Her politics? Wrong. Her strategy? Brilliant. That wasn't a politician. That was a prosecutor who knew exactly what she was doing. In the end, what Jasmine Crockett achieved wasn't just a viral moment. It was a generational statement, a bold challenge to entrenched power and performative justice. She didn't just answer a question, she changed the conversation. And the most remarkable part? Jasmine Crockett never flinched. She stood firm in the face of attempted intimidation, calmly dismantling decades of built-up legacy with nothing more than hard facts, airtight research, and unshakable conviction. That's exactly the kind of leadership voters across the spectrum say they want: authentic, fearless, and uncompromising, even when the spotlight is blinding and the stakes are sky-high. Meanwhile, the fallout for Judge Greg Mathis was immediate. Brutal. By sunrise the next morning, #Crockett exposes Mathisse was trending on every major social media platform, but it didn't stop there. The phrase #Mathisse prison money rocketed to the top of Twitter, igniting a firestorm that even his decades of public goodwill couldn't extinguish. Investigative journalists, many of whom had initially dismissed Crockett's revelations as minor or exaggerated, suddenly began digging deeper into Mathis's business ties. What they uncovered was far more damaging than anyone expected. The $2.30 million core correct contract was only the tip of the iceberg. Public records revealed that Mathis, through a tangled web of LLCs and consulting firms, had quietly raked in more than $8 million over the last 5 years. The money came from private prison corporations, bail bond associations, surveillance tech vendors, and law enforcement supply companies. All businesses with a direct stake in maintaining and expanding the criminal justice system. Mathis claimed to scrutinize from his bench. The Detroit Free Press, Mathis's hometown paper, and once a reliable cheerleader of his career, dropped a bombshell front-page expose titled, "Television Judge's Empire Built on Mass Incarceration." The piece detailed how Mathis had quietly constructed an empire that profited from the very same system he preached reform about on television. With charts, contracts, and damning emails, the investigation made one thing undeniable. The judge lectured America about justice. He was quietly enriching himself from injustice, and then came the unraveling. Mathis went on a media tour to try and control the damage. He appeared on The View, hoping to defend himself in a more forgiving forum, but instead, he walked into another storm. When Whoopi Goldberg asked why he never disclosed his financial ties before commenting on criminal justice policy, Mathis froze. "Judge," she said pointedly. You built your brand on accountability. So how do you not see that the public has a right to know who's paying you while you're preaching justice to them? He had no answer, and America noticed. Within days, 3 major sponsors pulled their advertising from Judge Mathis. The show's ratings, already on a slope decline, cratered, dropping 30% in a matter of weeks. Rumors began circulating that the show's future was in serious jeopardy, but for Jasmine Crockett, it was a political and personal breakthrough of historic proportions. Her congressional office reported receiving over 50,000 emails and calls. In the week following the broadcast, over 90% were messages of praise and support. Donations to her campaign exploded, even though she wasn't up for re-election for another 2 years. Her social media following doubled in days, and more importantly, her legislative influence skyrocketed. The Second Chance Act amendment, which had languished in Senate committee for months, suddenly found 3 new Republican co-sponsors. The Police Accountability and Transparency Act was pushed onto the Senate floor for an expedited vote. Even staunch conservatives who disagreed with Crockett ideologically had to acknowledge her brilliance. She's not just another #politician, said Senator John Cornyn of Texas. She does her research, she knows her stuff, and she knows how to deliver under pressure. I might not agree with her politics, but I respect her preparation. That was impressive. But this wasn't just about 2 individuals anymore. The Crockett-Mathis confrontation sparked a seismic shift in the intersection of politics, media, and public accountability. Across the nation, law schools, journalism programs, and political think tanks began dissecting the event. Harvard's Kennedy School of Government added the full video to its curriculum on political communication. Professors dubbed it a case study in strategic confrontation, a blueprint for how underdogs can prevail over entrenched power. Political consultants, speechwriters, and media coaches reviewed the footage, like NFL coaches breaking down Super Bowl plays. On his podcast, Democratic strategist James Carville explained, she didn't just answer tough questions, she reversed the power dynamic. Mathis tried to use his authority to silence her, and she used that very authority to expose his hypocrisy. That's political jujitsu, pure art. Meanwhile, the scandal had ripple effects far beyond the courtroom set. Dozens of other media, personalities, and television judges came under scrutiny. Major news networks revised their disclosure policies. The Society of Professional Journalists updated its code of ethics to require clearer guidelines around financial entanglements between media figures and industries they cover. Crockett's moment also became a rallying cry for young politicians, especially women of color, those who had long been underestimated in a political system that wasn't designed for them. She showed us what strength really looks like, tweeted Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. You don't have to defer to people just because they're older or more famous or louder. Sometimes the most respectful thing you can do is tell the truth, especially when it makes powerful people uncomfortable. Crockett didn't just win a debate, she exposed an empire, reshaped a conversation, and rewrote the rules. She proved that in an era of curated personas and media spin, the best defense is truth, the best offense is preparation, and the most powerful weapon in politics isn't money or fame, it's authenticity armed with receipts. And if you found Jasmine Crockett's dismantling of Judge Mathis as powerful as we did, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. We've got more political confrontations, more truth-telling, and more voices that refuse to be silenced coming your way. Who do you think should be held accountable next? Drop your suggestions in the comments. Your voice matters, especially now.